Yes. Okay, well, tell us about the Hastings Fluoridation.
Well, that was interesting. You see, fluoridation started in my country following an experiment. It was first of all called, later it was called a project, but because people in Hastings didn't like being experimented on. But the Hastings Fluoridation experiment was started in 1952. It started. The fluoride was added to the water supply there in late 1953 or 54. There's a little debate about when it started. But the experiment was reported in the New Zealand Dental Journal and is now cited in all the textbooks around the world, one of the pro-fluoridation studies. And of course I had believed it. It showed a dramatic up to 70–80% reduction in tooth decay after the introduction of fluoridation. But when I got to the stage where I was re-examining the whole situation, because I was convinced that fluoridation did more harm than good, I used our official information legislation to get from the health department their files dating back to that period and right up to the present. The fluoridation files of the New Zealand Department of Health. And I must say that was one of the biggest surprises in my life when I read them, because they revealed that in carrying out the experiment, the school dentists in Hastings had been instructed to change their method of diagnosing tooth decay. Now, the initial exams were done under the old method of diagnosis, when the teeth were heavily filled, and immediately the experiment started, they used a different method of diagnosis. They didn't call it a cavity until it pierced through the enamel. They used to fill it at the early stage, just a catch in the enamel. And the measurement was number of decayed, missing, filled teeth. Now that instruction was carried out by the school dentists because they were under firm instructions. It was a tightly controlled discipline service. So it was quite clear why there was a dramatic sudden reduction in the reported levels of tooth decay in Hastings. Also, the neighbouring town of Napier had been called the ideal control because it had the same water supply but without fluoride added to it. And after the first stage of the experiment, they found that there were fewer cavities, even despite the change of diagnosis in Hastings. Despite that change, which brought about a dramatic reduction, there was still less tooth decay in the control city, which had not been fluoridated, than there was in the fluoridated one. And so they dropped the control because they said it wasn't a suitable control after all. And you know, they came up with a lovely excuse. They had discovered that there was a previously unknown trace element, molybdenum, in some of the soil in the control city. And this must have caused this dramatic reduction in tooth decay, much lower than in the rest of New Zealand. Now, all the evidence I've looked for cannot substantiate that molybdenum story. And moreover, Napier was no different to the rest of New Zealand, and decay went on declining there as it did in the rest of New Zealand, but that fact was kept from the New Zealand public. They were told that it was fluoridation in Hastings which was causing them, and that all the other places must fluoridate, and they dutifully did. Not all of them, but about 50% of them. And I published that information in The Ecologist, an international environmental journal, and they've never been able to refute that finding which I found. It was, in effect, a rigged experiment. And that leads me to wonder how many of the other early fluoridation trials were carried out under similar circumstances. The person who carried out the experiment, now dead, came straight from the States, where he'd been taught there how to carry out fluoridation trials. Came from New Zealand, took over in Hastings and finished the experiment. The person who started the experiment in Hastings, Dr. Eric Hewitt, had said at the outset that he had an open mind and he wasn't fully convinced by the evidence from the United States. And the chairman of the committee which supervised that experiment, an appointee of the New Zealand Dental Association, said to me, and I interviewed him, "John, we had to get rid of Hewitt." And there are letters by him saying Hewitt was not a fluoridationist.
Now,
So Hewitt resigned and the trained fluoridator
Yeah.
from the States took over.
wow.
So if that was a jack-up, it was a contrived result, if anything was, and it's been shown to be so.
Yeah.
But despite that, I've got the files, I've got photocopied all the files, I can produce them, and one wonders how many, if you could get that sort of information from the other trials in the States, just how much. I don't say that the person who carried out the experiment was a conscious crook. I think they were so bedazzled by this marvellous thing from America, which they were convinced that they had to get the same result. And the chairman of the committee said to me, we were determined to repeat in New Zealand what had happened in the States. We got the result, he said with pride. And they've never explained that in that change of diagnosis which brought about the supposed decrease was not mentioned in any of the published accounts of the study.
One of the problems that we have, and this in my local area we have this problem. We have friends,